When appearances deceived and privilege collided, one woman's humiliation sparked a revolution that money couldn't buy but justice demanded. The morning sun streamed through the vast windows of Liberty International Airport, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Sarah Reynolds stood in line at the first-class check-in counter, dressed in simple jeans, sneakers, and an oversized cardigan. Her hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail, and she wore minimal makeup. Nothing about her appearance suggested wealth or status. When Sarah finally reached the counter, the gate agent, Diane Parker, looked her up and down with poorly concealed skepticism. Diane's perfectly manicured nails tapped impatiently on the keyboard as she asked for Sarah's identification with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "First class to Boston?" Diane questioned, her tone making it clear she found this unlikely. "I think there must be some mistake. This ticket is for economy." She pushed the boarding pass back towards Sarah without even checking the computer system. Sarah blinked in surprise. "No, that's incorrect. I have a first-class ticket. My husband booked it last week." She reached for her phone. "I can show you the confirmation email if you'd like." Diane's smile grew colder. "Ma'am, I've been working this counter for 15 years. I know what our first-class passengers look like, and frankly, you don't fit the profile. Perhaps you misunderstood the booking." Several people in line behind Sarah began to shuffle impatiently. A businessman in an expensive suit cleared his throat loudly, checking his Rolex watch with exaggerated movements. The confrontation was beginning to draw attention. Sarah felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment as several nearby passengers turned to watch. She'd never been one to make a scene, and the public scrutiny made her want to disappear. "Could you please just check my reservation in the system?" Sarah asked quietly, trying to maintain her composure. "The ticket was purchased under my husband's name, Michael Reynolds." Diane sighed dramatically, making a show of her inconvenience as she typed into the computer. Her eyebrows raised slightly, but her expression quickly hardened again. "There appears to be some kind of error in our system. These tickets are reserved for our premium customers. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while I call my supervisor." By now, a small crowd had gathered, watching the exchange with curious eyes. The businessman who had been waiting pushed forward. "Excuse me, some of us have important meetings to get to. Could you serve those of us who actually belong in first class?" Sarah felt as if she'd been slapped. She stepped back, clutching her carry-on bag tighter. A security officer approached, having been summoned by another gate agent. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, looking directly at Sarah as if she were the obvious source of any disturbance. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone. She'd never wanted to be that person who pulled rank or made demands based on who her husband was. Michael had always respected her independence, her desire to be valued for herself rather than his wealth or influence. But this humiliation had gone too far. "I need to make a call," Sarah said quietly, stepping away from the counter. Michael Reynolds was in the middle of a board meeting when his phone vibrated. He rarely took calls during meetings, but seeing Sarah's name flash across the screen, he excused himself immediately. Something in his gut told him this wasn't a routine call. Sarah explained the situation in a hushed voice, her words occasionally catching in her throat. As she spoke, Michael's expression darkened. The board members waiting in the conference room would have recognized that look. It was the same one he wore before acquiring failing companies or outmaneuvering business rivals. "Stay right where you are," Michael said calmly. "Don't move." 45 minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up to the airport entrance. Michael Reynolds stepped out, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Unlike his wife, his appearance screamed wealth and authority. Behind him walked two people, his chief legal counsel and the regional director of the airline, who had been summoned from a golf course, judging by his hastily changed attire. The trio moved through the terminal with purpose. Other travelers instinctively moved aside, sensing the energy radiating from the group. Security personnel recognized the airline director and quickly cleared a path. Sarah was sitting on a bench near the check-in area, her eyes red but her composure restored. When she saw Michael, she stood, and he wrapped her in a tight embrace before kissing her forehead. "I'm sorry I troubled you," she whispered. "I could have just taken economy." Michael shook his head. Never apologize for expecting to be treated with respect. He turned to face the check-in counter, where Diane was still working, now looking noticeably nervous as she'd recognized the regional director approaching. The airline director stepped forward, his face a mask of professional concern hiding obvious panic. "Ms. Parker, could you step away from the counter for a moment?" It wasn't a question. Diane's replacement quickly processed Sarah's correct first-class boarding pass, while Michael stood silently watching, his arm protectively around his wife's shoulders. In a private room away from prying eyes, Michael finally spoke. His voice was surprisingly quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made his words more devastating. 7 years ago, when I was looking to invest in airlines, yours was on my shortlist, he told the regional director. I ultimately went with your competitor because during my research, I encountered one of your employees who treated my mother, who was dressed similarly to my wife today. With the same disdain your staff showed Sarah, I decided any company that trains its employees to judge customers by their appearance wasn't worth my investment. The director blanched. Everyone in the industry knew that Michael Reynolds' investment had transformed their competitor from a struggling regional carrier to an international powerhouse. What happened today isn't just about my wife, Michael continued. It's about every person who's been judged, dismissed, or humiliated because they didn't fit someone's profile of success or worth. The Monday following the airport incident dawned with a deceptive normalcy across the airline's corporate headquarters. Employees filed in through the revolving glass doors, coffee cups in hand, unaware that seismic shifts were already in motion beneath the polished marble floors of the executive suite. The first tremors began at precisely 8:30 am, when the CEO received a hand-delivered letter bearing the unmistakable letterhead of Reynolds Enterprises. The contents of that single page would alter the trajectory of dozens of careers and ultimately reshape the culture of an entire corporation. By 9:15 am, Diane Parker received a call at her modest apartment instructing her to come in for an urgent meeting, despite it being her scheduled day off. She arrived at the terminal still wearing the faint smugness that had characterized her 15-year tenure, a smugness that evaporated when she was escorted not to her usual station, but to human resources. The meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes. She departed without her employee badge, carrying a small box of personal effects and a termination letter citing violation of company policy, resulting in customer discrimination. Her supervisor, Gregory Watkins, who had backed her decision regarding Sarah Reynolds, received a similar call 30 minutes later. By noon, 2 careers built over decades had disintegrated like sandcastles before an incoming tide. The businessman who had made the disparaging comment, identified as venture capitalist Edward Harrington, discovered his fate when attempting to book a flight for an investors' meeting later that week. The reservation system flagged his name with a polite but firm message. We regret to inform you that you are currently ineligible for service with our airline. Please contact customer relations. His indignant calls to customer service were met with professional courtesy and immovable resolve. The recordings of his subsequent tirade were later used in the airline's revised training materials as examples of how entitlement can manifest when privilege is challenged. But Michael Reynolds had long understood something that escaped many of his wealthy peers. Individual punishments, while sometimes necessary, rarely address systemic problems. True change required structural transformation. By Wednesday of that week, he had leveraged his considerable network to arrange a private meeting with 3 key members of the airline's board of directors at his downtown office. The meeting was scheduled for 45 minutes. It lasted 3 hours. Inside that wood-paneled conference room, Michael laid out a comprehensive vision that went far beyond the incident with his wife. He presented research compiled by his team showing customer satisfaction metrics correlated with socioeconomic indicators, data revealing that customers perceived as having lower incomes consistently reported feeling marginalized across multiple service touchpoints. He detailed the financial implications, lost loyalty, negative word of mouth, and the untapped market of customers who might choose competitors where they felt more valued. "Gentlemen," Michael had said, leaning forward across the polished mahogany table, "what happened to Sarah isn't just a moral failure. Though it certainly is that. It's a business failure. Every person you alienate based on appearance represents not just one lost customer, but potentially dozens within their social circle. In the age of social media, that circle extends indefinitely." One of the directors, Alan Peterson, attempted to frame the incident as isolated. "With all due respect, Mr. Reynolds, we're talking about two employees making poor judgments. Our policies explicitly prohibit discrimination." Michael's response came with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Policies without consistent enforcement are just words on paper, Mr. Peterson. Your company culture rewards employees who protect premium services from those they deem unworthy. I've spent the past week speaking with former employees of your airline. This incident wasn't an anomaly. It was the predictable outcome of unspoken expectations." The directors left Michael's office visibly shaken, carrying with them two items: a formal legal notice outlining potential discrimination suits that could be pursued, and a detailed proposal for organizational transformation that could render such legal action unnecessary. The choice, as Michael framed it, was entirely theirs. By Friday, the airline announced the formation of a Service Excellence Task Force to review customer interaction protocols. The press release made no mention of the Reynolds incident, but industry insiders recognized the timing was far from coincidental. What the public announcement didn't reveal was the frantic activity happening behind the scenes: emergency board meetings, late-night strategy sessions, and the quiet engagement of one of the nation's top diversity and inclusion consulting firms. The following weeks saw a cascade of changes rippling through the organization. The airline's training programs underwent complete revision, with new modules specifically addressing unconscious bias and the dangers of making assumptions based on appearance. Customer service metrics were recalibrated to measure equitable treatment alongside efficiency and problem resolution. Mystery shoppers of various backgrounds and appearances began making regular flights, reporting back on their experiences in granular detail. Perhaps most significantly, the compensation structure for gate agents and customer service representatives was restructured to eliminate incentives that implicitly encouraged staff to guard premium services against those who didn't fit preconceived notions of who belonged in first class. Instead, bonuses were tied to consistent service delivery regardless of a customer's appearance or status. When news of these changes began circulating through industry channels, competing airlines took notice. Several initiated their own internal reviews, recognizing that similar vulnerabilities likely existed within their organizations. What had begun as one woman's humiliation was evolving into an industry-wide examination of systemic biases. Sarah Reynolds, meanwhile, had initially wanted nothing to do with these developments. "I just want to forget it happened," she told Michael over dinner one evening, pushing food around her plate. "I never wanted to use your position to punish anyone." Michael reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "This isn't about punishment, Sarah. It's about transformation. What if your experience could prevent thousands of others from facing the same humiliation?" That conversation marked a turning point. After careful consideration, Sarah agreed to a modified role in the process, declining media interviews but consenting to meet with the airline's executive team to share her experience firsthand. Her testimony, delivered without rancor but with unflinching honesty, brought several executives to tears and proved more powerful than any consultant's presentation. As part of the settlement agreement that kept the incident out of court, the airline established the Eleanor Wright Scholarship Fund, named after Sarah's grandmother who had raised her after her parents' death. The fund would provide educational opportunities and aviation career pathways for young people from underrepresented backgrounds. The initial endowment of $5 million came directly from the airline, with Michael privately matching the amount. Eleanor Wright had been a housekeeper who raised Sarah in a small apartment above the garage of one of the homes she cleaned. Despite their modest circumstances, she had instilled in Sarah an unshakable sense of dignity that transcended material possessions. "Never let anyone make you feel small because of what you have or don't have," she had told Sarah repeatedly. "Your worth isn't in your wallet." That Sarah would later marry one of the wealthiest men in the country was an irony not lost on her. Nor was the fact that her grandmother's wisdom remained her moral compass, despite the radical change in her financial circumstances. 3 months after the incident, the first cohort of Eleanor Wright scholars was selected, 20 young people who might otherwise never have considered careers in aviation. The airline's commitment went beyond financial support, providing mentorship and guaranteed internships upon completion of relevant coursework. Sarah attended the scholarship reception, choosing again to dress simply. This time, however, she was treated with deference that had nothing to do with her husband's wealth and everything to do with the program's recognition of her grandmother's values. The transformation within the airline continued to unfold in ways both visible and subtle. Gate agents received additional training in customer recognition that emphasized name identification rather than appearance-based assessments. The first-class check-in counter was redesigned to be less physically separated from other service areas, reducing the visual stratification that had contributed to an atmosphere of exclusion. Even the language in employee handbooks was revised, replacing terms like high-value customers with premium service subscribers, a subtle but significant shift that emphasized the transaction rather than inherent worth. 6 months into these changes, the airline's customer satisfaction scores showed marked improvement across all demographics. Perhaps more tellingly, employee retention rates increased as staff reported feeling less pressure to make snap judgments and more empowered to provide consistent service. The financial impact was still being calculated, but early indicators suggested that the costs of implementation were being offset by increased customer loyalty and positive word of mouth. What Michael Reynolds understood, and what the airline was beginning to learn, was that true luxury wasn't about exclusion, but about exceptional service delivered with dignity to everyone. The most prestigious brands in the world had long recognized this principle. The airline was merely catching up to a standard that should have been foundational. On the anniversary of the incident, the airline's newly appointed Chief Customer Officer, a position created as part of the organizational restructuring, sent Sarah a handwritten note of gratitude. "Your experience forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our culture," she wrote. "The changes implemented in response have made us not just a more equitable company, but a better one by every measure. Sometimes transformation requires a catalyst. Thank you for being ours, however involuntarily." Sarah read the note twice before placing it in a small wooden box where she kept her grandmother's few mementos: a tarnished locket, a well-worn Bible, and a faded photograph of the woman whose values had shaped her life. Eleanor Wright had passed away 3 years before Sarah met Michael, never knowing the material comfort her granddaughter would eventually enjoy. But as Sarah closed the keepsake box, she felt certain that her grandmother would have found this outcome: systemic change that extended opportunity to others, far more valuable than any first-class ticket. 6 months after the incident that had transformed both her life and an entire corporation, Sarah Reynolds found herself standing in the familiar departure hall of Liberty International Airport. The space looked physically unchanged. The same soaring ceilings, the same polished floors reflecting the morning light that streamed through the vast windows. Yet to Sarah, everything felt different. The knot of anxiety that had formed in her stomach during the drive to the airport wasn't about fear of humiliation this time, but the natural nervousness of someone about to address an audience. Sarah had deliberated for weeks when the airline first approached her about speaking to their newest class of customer service representatives. Her initial instinct had been to decline. She had never sought the spotlight, had never wanted to leverage her husband's position or wealth for personal gain or recognition. The very idea of standing before a group of strangers to discuss what had been a deeply humiliating experience made her palms sweat and her heart race. But Michael had gently encouraged her to reconsider. "Your voice is the one they need to hear," he had told her one evening as they sat in the garden of their home, the setting sun casting long shadows across the immaculately maintained lawn. "Not mine, not the executives, not the consultants they've hired. Yours." Sarah had looked down at her hands, remembering how they had trembled that day at the check-in counter. "I'm not a public speaker," she had protested weakly. "I wouldn't know what to say." Michael's smile had been gentle but knowing. "Just tell the truth. That's always been more than enough." So here she was, dressed again in jeans and a simple blouse, a deliberate choice to mirror her appearance on that fateful day. No designer labels, no expensive accessories. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, her makeup minimal. She carried the same worn leather shoulder bag that had belonged to her grandmother, a treasured connection to the woman who had taught her that dignity was inherent, not purchased. The airline's new training center occupied the entire third floor of an administrative building adjacent to the terminal. Sarah was escorted through security with a deference that felt almost uncomfortable after her previous experience. The young woman guiding her through the building spoke with barely concealed awe, clearly aware of who Sarah was, or rather, who her husband was. "Mrs. Reynolds, it's such an honor to have you here today." The woman gushed as they rode the elevator. "The change is your situation. Inspired have been incredible for us as employees. We don't feel like we're walking on eggshells anymore, trying to figure out who belongs where." Sarah smiled politely, though the comment revealed volumes about the previous culture. "I'm glad something positive came from it," she replied simply. The training room was arranged with rows of chairs facing a small stage with a podium. As Sarah entered, 35 trainees in crisp new uniforms rose to their feet in a gesture of respect that made her blush. At the back of the room stood a familiar figure. Her husband had insisted on attending, but had been equally insistent that he remain in the background. This was her moment, not his. The new customer service director stepped forward to introduce her. Sarah recognized him immediately as the security officer who had approached her during the original incident, the one who had automatically assumed she was the problem. His transformation was perhaps the most visible symbol of the changes that had occurred. "Most of you know the story," the director began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "6 months ago, we failed. Not just as individuals, but as an organization. We failed to recognize that our biases were costing us not just our integrity, but our effectiveness as a business. Today, you'll hear from the woman whose experience became the catalyst for the most significant cultural transformation in our company's history." Sarah took a deep breath as she approached the podium. Public speaking had never been her strength, but she had prepared carefully for this moment, writing and rewriting her remarks until Michael had gently taken the much-revised pages from her hands. "Just speak from your heart," he had advised. "That's always been your greatest strength." Looking out at the attentive faces, Sarah began slowly, her voice gaining confidence with each word. "I wasn't born into wealth," she told them, deciding in that moment to abandon her prepared remarks. "My grandmother raised me in a small apartment above a garage. She cleaned houses for a living, including the homes of several airline executives, ironically enough." This drew a small ripple of surprised laughter from the audience. "She taught me that dignity isn't something that can be purchased or earned through material success. It's inherent in every human being from birth. When I married Michael," she glanced briefly toward the back of the room, "my financial circumstances changed dramatically. But who I am didn't change. The day I stood at your counter in jeans and sneakers, I was the same person I would have been in designer clothes." Sarah paused, gathering her thoughts. What happened that day wasn't unique to me or to this airline. Every day, people are judged, dismissed, or humiliated because they don't match someone's profile of success or worth. The difference in my case was that I happened to be married to someone with the resources and influence to demand accountability. She leaned slightly forward, her gaze sweeping across the room. "My husband could have walked in that day and fired everyone in sight. He certainly had the power to do so. He could have bought a controlling interest in this airline, and replaced the entire board of directors if he wanted to. Another murmur rippled through the audience. Most of them hadn't realized the full extent of Michael Reynolds' financial capabilities. But instead, Sarah continued, he chose to transform a moment of humiliation into an opportunity for change. Not just punishment, not just retribution, but genuine systemic improvement. Because the truly powerful thing isn't having the ability to get people fired. The real power lies in creating systems where everyone feels valued regardless of what they're wearing or how much money they have in the bank. She gestured toward the training materials on their desks, completely redesigned protocols that emphasized customer identification through names and reservation details rather than appearances. These new procedures aren't just about avoiding discrimination lawsuits. They're about recognizing the fundamental humanity in every person who approaches your counter, regardless of how they present themselves. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah shared specific details of her experience that day. The small glances, the dismissive tone, the assumptions made not just by staff, but by other passengers. She described the sinking feeling in her stomach as she realized she was being judged, the heat of embarrassment rising to her cheeks, the momentary question of whether she should simply back down and accept being relegated to economy despite having a valid first-class ticket. It's the small moments of dismissal that often wound the deepest, she explained. A raised eyebrow, a skeptical glance, a tone of voice that suggests disbelief. These might seem insignificant to the person delivering them, but to the recipient, they can feel like a public declaration of unworthiness. As she spoke, Sarah noticed several trainees wiping away tears, while others nodded in recognition. She realized that many of them had likely experienced similar judgments in their own lives, perhaps even within this very organization before the changes were implemented. The most powerful question you can ask yourselves in any customer interaction is not, does this person belong here? But rather, how can I make this person feel that they absolutely belong here, regardless of who they are or how they present themselves? Sarah concluded her remarks by sharing something she hadn't planned to reveal, that she had initially opposed the firing of Diane and her supervisor. I didn't want anyone to lose their livelihood, she admitted. What I wanted was for them to understand how their actions made me feel, and to do better in the future. The scholarship program that now bears my grandmother's name represents what I believe to be the most meaningful outcome of this situation, creating opportunities for people who might otherwise be overlooked or underestimated, just as my grandmother often was. When she finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Sarah stepped back from the podium, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. She had transformed her own humiliation into something that might prevent others from experiencing the same. The new customer service director stepped forward again, thanking Sarah for her candor. What Mrs. Reynolds experienced should never happen to anyone in our care, he told the trainees. My own role in that day is something I will always regret. I made assumptions based on appearances rather than facts. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to be part of building a different kind of culture. As the formal presentation concluded, several trainees approached Sarah individually, sharing their own experiences of being judged or dismissed in various contexts. One young woman, her eyes bright with emotion, gripped Sarah's hand tightly. My mother cleans houses, she whispered. When I tell people that, I see the same look you described. That subtle shift in how they perceive me. Hearing your story makes me feel like maybe I don't have to be ashamed of where I come from. Sarah embraced the young woman impulsively. Your mother's work is honorable, she said firmly. Never let anyone make you feel otherwise. As Sarah and Michael finally prepared to leave, the airline's CEO approached them in the corridor. Unlike the previous leadership, this CEO had been brought in specifically to guide the cultural transformation, selected in part for her demonstrated commitment to equity in customer experience. The Eleanor Wright Scholars are thriving, she told them with evident pride. 2 have already been accepted into our pilot training program for after graduation. Would it be possible for you to meet with them sometime? Your grandmother's legacy is shaping their futures in profound ways. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. The thought of her grandmother, A woman who had never set foot on an airplane, who had spent decades cleaning other people's homes, now inspiring young people to reach for the skies, was almost overwhelming. "I'd be honored," she managed to say. As they walked through the terminal toward the exit, Michael slipped his arm around Sarah's waist. "Your grandmother would have been incredibly proud today," he said quietly. Sarah nodded, watching the flow of humanity through the busy airport. People of all backgrounds hurrying to destinations unknown, each carrying their own stories and circumstances. "She always said that true worth isn't about what you have, but what you give," she replied. "I think maybe today I finally understood what she meant." They passed the first-class check-in counter, where the incident had occurred 6 months earlier. The physical space had been redesigned, no longer separated by imposing barriers from the main check-in area, now more accessible while still providing premium service. A new agent was assisting an elderly woman dressed in a simple tracksuit, treating her with the same attentive respect that might once have been reserved for those in business attire. Sarah smiled to herself. The change was real. Not perfect, perhaps, but meaningful. And it had begun with her refusal to accept being judged by her appearance rather than her humanity. As they stepped outside into the bright afternoon sunlight, Sarah realized something profound. That influence, whether it comes from wealth or position, or simply the courage to speak truth, carries with it responsibility. Her husband had used his considerable power not for vengeance but for transformation, and she, in her own quieter way, had done the same. The simple woman who had been denied boarding 6 months ago walked confidently to the waiting car, no longer defined by that moment of humiliation, but by the positive change it had inspired. The true measure of power, she now understood, wasn't in who you could get fired, but in how many lives you could help elevate.